This is the Shel'tain affair. Written by Jude Reed. Unofficial audio narration by Joe Silva. Humanity is a superstitious species. Old notions of faith and fate are carried in our flesh like parasites, weighing us down as we strive to transcend the shackles of the past. Our minds have evolved to seek meaning in the patterns of random chance, and if history is to be believed, we find those patterns with tiresome regularity. Perhaps the search for greater meaning lies at the heart of what makes us human, and it is only once we overcome that part of our nature that we will achieve our true potential. And yet, as the blast of the exploding groundcar took me from my feet and threw me across the windswept clifftop like a doll hurled by an angry child, all I could think of was the sheer arbitrariness of my own survival. A superstitious woman would have seen the hand of fate in that moment, even come to believe that she had survived through some caprice of destiny or the will of an imagined god. But I knew better. The fact I was still alive was the result of my own actions, and of random chance, nothing more or less than that. I was in no doubt as to what had just happened. The brand that Malcador the Sigillite had placed so recently on the skin of my palm might as well have been a target painted between my shoulder blades. But even so, questions flooded my mind like rushing water. Who had ordered my death was not in question. Here, in the isolated and windswept Shel'tain territories, no one but the High Duke possessed the audacity or the means. The more interesting question was why. I had arrived on Shel'tain less than 6 hours before, and had been met at the landing site by the High Duke himself in an elegant steel-gray groundcar. As the newly made Agentia Tertius of Lord Malcador, I supposed I should have expected nothing less. But my title was fresh enough that the deference and respect it brought with it were strange after a life of interactions characterized by fear and revulsion. The instinctive repugnance that everyone felt in my presence persisted, of course, but it was curious to see it masked by a veneer of courtesy. "Welcome to Shel'tain, Lady Amendera." The High Duke's voice was low, but contained a sharp edge that cut across the rising wind. "We are honored by your visit. What service can our humble house offer you?" I let the breeze take his words and regarded him in silence. High Duke Sethir of Shel'tain was a lean, well-preserved man in his late middle age, with upswept silver hair and eyes the precise color of the dull gray rock beneath his feet. He wore a suit of mesh armor, as fine as my own, with a brindled fur mantle draped nonchalantly around his shoulders. His mouth curved in a smile of welcome that betrayed no trace of the revulsion he must have felt in my proximity. This was a man whose family had weathered the storms of Terra for 1,000 years, and he looked every inch the part. "Lord Malcador has sent me to inspect your holdings." I took a step towards him, wondering if he would recoil, but he stood his ground. "He wishes to ascertain the nature and extent of your loyalty to the Emperor." "Of course," the High Duke inclined his head. "I am at your disposal." Silence fell again. Since leaving the Silent Sisterhood, an order of witch-seekers charged with eradicating all sorcerous threats to the Imperium, I found the endless chatter that surrounded me tiresome and draining. I had quickly learned that most individuals were unable to resist filling the gaps in conversation, and consequently could be relied upon to spill all manner of inappropriate confidences. Much to my inconvenience, however, it seemed the High Duke was possessed of steel within as well as without. It took a full 3 hours to inspect the Shel'tain holdings, and by the end of the tour, I was left with the impression that I had barely scratched the surface. The complex was squat and ugly, somewhere between a factotum and a fortress, clinging to the edge of a gray granite cliff. Centuries ago, Shel'tain had been an island chain whose settlements overlooked a vast ocean, but now the plain below the promontory stretched to the far horizon in an infinite expanse of white sand. Thin northern sunlight glinted across a silver net of cables connected to an array of geothermal lances driven deep into Terra's crust. The planet's resources might be all but spent, but the fires burning at its heart were still a font of limitless power for those with the means to harvest them. "May I offer you refreshments, Lady Amendera?" the High Duke asked, when we had returned to the great stone portico where he had begun the tour hours before. I waved his offer away and tried to conceal my frustration. What was the man hiding? In my brief tenure as Lord Malcador's bloodhound, I had found few individuals who displayed the High Duke's remarkable degree of composure. The mere mention of the sigillite should have sent even the innocent into paroxysms of self-doubt, but the High Duke displayed only effortless confidence. "Then allow me to extend the invitation to explore my home as you see fit. I would have you return to Lord Malcador secure in the knowledge that Shel'tain's loyalty is beyond reproach." My thoughts scrabbled for purchase on what was rapidly turning into an insoluble problem. The High Duke might well have omitted areas of his holdings from the tour he had so generously provided, but I had seen no signs of hidden doors or false walls that hinted at secret passageways. Short of pulling on every sconce and bookcase in the building, I had no idea where I would even start to look. Leaving now and returning later with soldiers was another option, but I feared that Lord Malcador would take a dim view of destruction wreaked on an ally whose crimes were yet unproven. But that was the problem. There was no proof. Shel'tain had declared his loyalty to the Emperor early in his wars of unification, and as his star had risen, so too had the Shel'tain families. Rivals had fallen away, one after another, perishing with startling regularity each time they might have stood in the High Duke's way, though never with any evidence to link the family to the deaths. In more superstitious times, such relentless prosperity in the face of overwhelming hardship might have been considered a mark of divine favor, but I had been sent here in search of a more rational explanation. It was clear that Malcador suspected Shel'tain of something, but he had declined to share his reasons when he dispatched me to find out more. Not for the first time, I had found myself wondering why my lord had sent me rather than any one of a dozen more suitable agents. My presence here sent a clear message to the High Duke, that if evidence of his guilt was found, the wrath of the sigillite would be swift and merciless. But I could not shake the feeling that there was something more to it than that. My mentor had been clear that I was here to investigate, not to punish, and that I would need more than my battlefield skills if I were to succeed. I rather feared that the High Duke was not the only one being tested. The door swung open, and a young woman in gray household livery walked briskly to the High Duke's side. As she whispered into his ear, Lord Sethier's expression changed to one of doubt, irritation, and, there it was, an unmistakable hint of fear. His serene mask of confidence reasserted itself immediately, but the damage was already done. The High Duke was hiding something, just as Malcador had suspected. All I had to do was find out what. That turned out to be easier in principle than in practice. I spent another 2 fruitless hours prowling the citadel, the huge steel doors that separated one section from the next parting obediently at my approach. The household staff were dutiful and courteous, permitting me access to the gardens, the servants' quarters, even the vast turbine chamber beneath the great hall, all of which showed no sign of wrongdoing. I could not shake the image of skating over ice floes, the dark and hungry water waiting beneath my feet. When I had walked through the tapestried hall for the 3rd time, I knew I was defeated. I was, as I had known from the outset, the wrong agent for this task, and all that was left for me to do was to return in failure. The High Duke was the soul of civility as he bade me farewell, offering me the use of his groundcar, and its driver to return to my Arvis lighter. I accepted without thinking, my mind a tangle of second-guess suspicions, fears, and worries as we sped along the clifftop road. From the back of the vehicle, I watched the tech fortress receding through armor-glass fogged with condensation and stippled with raindrops, as if my gaze alone could force it to give up its secrets. Then, as the groundcar rattled over a pothole, the sudden jolt broke my chain of thought. I looked up to see the driver leaning forward, one hand reaching under his chair. His eyes were fixed on the road, but the tension in his shoulders was unmistakable. He was ready to move. I reacted a second too late. Before I could grab the pistol on my belt, the groundcar screeched to a halt, the deceleration sending me slamming against the back of the seat in front. A slug punched a hole in the cushion where my head had been a moment ago, filling the air with smoke, stuffing, and the scent of cordite. I drew my auto pistol and took a blind shot through the driver's seat, then threw my weight against the side door. It burst open, and I rolled to the ground, scrambled back to my feet, and tore open the driver's door. The man was still in his seat, the front of his uniform stained scarlet with blood, his face an ugly shade of gray. I grabbed his collar and dragged him out of the vehicle, slammed his back against the external plating, and lifted him so his eyes were level with mine. They widened with panic, the discomfort of my proximity enough to cut through even the horror of his approaching death. The High Duke. I loosened my grip a fraction so that he could draw a labored breath through bloody lips. What is he hiding? The driver shook his head. I clamped my hand around his windpipe so suddenly that his eyes visibly bulged. Tell me or die. The threat rang hollow. What sense was there in intimidating an already dying man? I could tell from his smile that he knew that as well as I did. He opened his hand and let a small metallic object drop to the ground. A detonator. His lips moved, but the time for talking was past. Still gripping him by the neck, I turned and ran, his body held behind me like a shield, and the ground car exploded. I woke to a burning world. With no clearer sense of direction than away, I crawled on hands and knees until the fiery heat in my lungs eased, then looked back at the wreckage of the ground car. From the state of its remains, a blazing tangle of twisted metal and shattered armor glass, the explosive charge had been a sizable one, most likely positioned below the engine block. My suit of golden chain armor had done much to absorb and deflect the energy of the blast, and the driver's body had provided an additional layer of protection. Only his scattered remains were recognizable: an arm, still covered in the sleeve of a steel-gray tunic, a splintered rack of ribs, a severed head lying face down in the dirt. I took another painful breath and tried to steady my racing heart. My lungs ached as though I had been exposed to vacuum, my ears still ringing with the blast, my mouth full of the taste of copper and ash. I ran my hands over my scalp and brought them away covered in the charred remains of my close-cropped black hair. There was a fresh laceration over my right eye, a new battle scar for the Aquila on my forehead, and a latticework of shallow cuts stood out in vivid crimson against the skin of my hands. I made a quick evaluation of my assets and found them woefully limited. My pistol and dagger had survived the explosion unscathed, but my Vox bead had slipped free of my ear at some point during my involuntary flight, and was now one unidentifiable shard of metal amongst 100. I thought of my sword, safely stored on the Arvis, and a pang of regret shot through me. I had feared that arriving on a diplomatic mission with an executioner great blade slung across my back might leave the High Duke with altogether the wrong impression of my intentions, but now its absence felt like a missing limb. What would a trained agent do? My options were narrowing by the moment. I could strike out for my lander on foot, but that was an unappealing prospect that gave the advantage to those with local knowledge and access to transport. The cliff top was a stark expanse of granite that promised neither shelter nor concealment, and all the combat training of my years in the Silent Sisterhood would not protect me when the High Duke's soldiers came in force. Survival seemed impossible. But then, I had survived impossible odds before. I thought back to my days on Luna, and the hours spent beneath the shimmering domes of the Somnus Citadel. I might be all but unarmed, but I could be every bit as quick and devious as the High Duke himself, no matter how far superior his weapons or extensive his reach. And when fighting an enemy whose reach exceeds your own, the only way to win is to close the distance and get inside their guard. I shot a glance to the cliff edge and my stomach gave a lurch. My only route of escape lay down the rocky escarpment, and from the roar of an approaching engine, it seemed there was no time to waste. Keeping low to the ground, I half ran, half crawled through the smoky air towards the ledge. For a second, I had the irrational instinct that I had arrived at the edge of the world with only a long drop into nothingness ahead of me. The fine white sand gleamed far below, promising a swift death for any fool clumsy enough to fall. Lumen beams cut through the mist. Dirt cycles, 2 of them. I dropped flat on my belly, swung myself over the ledge, and instantly regretted it as the world fell away beneath me. I fixed my gaze on the cliff face and fought back panic, forcing myself to move one hand, 1 foot, and 1 breath at a time. Above me, voices drifted back and forth in the wind, fading in and out of audibility. "How long are we supposed to wait?" a woman said. From her tone, she was making little effort to hide her frustration. Her companion sounded calmer and considerably closer. "Until the fire burns low enough to check for another body inside." I risked a look up and saw a pair of booted feet. A cloud of falling low ash stirred to eddies by the wind. If whoever was standing there looked down, they could hardly fail to see me. Taking care not to dislodge the rocks, I lifted my right hand and pulled my pistol from its holster. If spotted, I would have time for a single shot. I had no doubt that the slug would find its target, but the recoil would blow me off the cliff in the process. A voxcaster gave a static crackle. "Yes, my lord," the man said, and paused for what could only be the High Duke's reply. "Until the flames are extinguished, it will be impossible to tell. Skaro and Venka have continued to the landing pad, just in case." Another pause. "Of course, my lord." The vox static crackled again, then died. A sharp-edged flurry of gravel struck my head and shoulders, the pain of which less of an issue than the indignity. "What's wrong with you?" the woman asked, and this time I shared her grievance. "Do you want to stand here all night?" There was a long silence before the man answered. I hung motionless, my fingertips and forearms burning. "I don't know," he said at last. "Something feels wrong here." I could have told him exactly what he was sensing. I could only hope that he lacked the wit to identify the feeling for what it really was. The woman snorted. "Come away from the edge then, you fool!" More gravel showered down on me as the man's footsteps receded. I let out a long, careful breath. The woman's short temper had bought me time, but the wreckage would only burn for so long. I risked another glance at the ground below, tracing the lines of the heavy metal cabling that connected the geothermal lances. They converged on a single part of the cliffside, heading into a wide-mouthed cavern directly below the fortress. That was where the power taken from Terra's heart entered the High Duke's domain. I could take the same route inside. By the time I reached the base of the cliff, my shoulders were burning and my legs shaking as though I had spent a full day on the training ground. The cavern mouth loomed ahead of me, the cables coiling around themselves like a nest of serpents as they vanished inside. I paused to catch my breath, one eye fixed on the cliff edge in case any of the High Duke's guards returned. Why had Sethir decided that my death had been necessary? Surely such an astute politician must have realized Lord Malkador would hardly accept the disappearance of his agent at face value. If I had been in possession of irrefutable evidence to suggest the High Duke's guilt, then I might have understood his reasoning, but I was as ignorant of his sins now, except for the attempt on my life, as I had been on my arrival. The assassination made no sense, and nor did its timing. Why wait until I was en route to my vessel, when he might just as easily have dispatched me in the privacy of his own home? It had to be something to do with the message the servant had delivered to him. That news had set off a chain of events that made my death preferable to allowing me to leave Shel'tain. But what had she told him? My sideways scramble along the shoreline ended abruptly at the gathered conduits. Vast, rubberized cables banded with copper, each of them thicker than my waist, as they entered the cave mouth. There was no walkway alongside them, but looking into the depths of the cavern, I could make out a faint crimson lumen glow. It was as I had hoped. An engineering project on this scale required access to the main building for repair and upkeep, and no one could expect the maintenance teams to arrive by the same unorthodox route that I had. My legs and shoulders still aching, I sank into the shadow of the cabling and prowled towards the light. Inside the cavern, it stank of sulfur and oil, the air full of the heat and thunder of heavy machinery. Scarlet lumens shone upwards, scattering photons into smoke and vapor and projecting the distorted shadow of a single worker onto the dripping stone walls. A narrow gantry overlooked the cavern at its innermost extent, suspended 1.5 meters above the ground and accessed by a heavy metal door set securely into the stone. I found myself once again longing for my greatsword. The blade would have made short work of the heavy steel that kept me from the citadel's interior, but I had no such faith in either of my other weapons. Once again, the lessons of the Somnus Citadel were to be my salvation. The weakness the matriarchs had taught us was never in the armor, but in what it protected. The laborer moved along the walkway behind a metal guardrail, monitoring dials, adjusting valves, sending plumes of scalding steam into the already cloudy air. As I watched, the door opened and a second man emerged, tucking something that might have been an access wafer back into the pocket of his tunic. There it was, the weak point in the building's armor. Now I knew where to strike. I crept forward and crouched beneath the gantry. I could see the laborer's booted feet through the cross-hatched metal, moving back and forth as they tended the machinery. Dispatching 2 untrained combatants would take mere moments, but if one of them triggered an emergency alarm, then the situation would rapidly spiral out of control. I aimed my auto pistol at the man standing above me, waited for the next discharge of steam to billow from the pipes, and fired. The slug pierced him like a lance from below, and he fell to the floor before the steam had subsided. I swung myself up and over the guardrail and stood over his corpse. The other laborer was oblivious, his attention fixed on the network of pipes and valves directly ahead of him. A second shot from my auto pistol would have been the most straightforward solution, but instead I closed the distance, choosing silence over convenience. I was less than 1 meter away when he turned around, his expression switching from slack-jawed resignation to alarm. I silenced him with a single blow to the throat, then lowered him carefully to the floor and took his access wafer. He was still breathing, though whether that state of affairs would continue for long was anyone's guess. The door opened obediently in response to my newly acquired access wafer, and I stepped into a narrow passageway that wound through a maintenance level carved deep into the rock. Power conduits and water pipes ran along the walls at ankle height. The same dull red lumens I had seen in the cavern lit the tunnel, giving the hewn stone walls an eerie, blood-stained appearance, as though I were moving through the slain carcass of a monstrous beast. The sound of booted feet echoed down the corridor. By the sound of it, 5 or 6 guards were approaching at speed. A professionally trained agent of Lord Malkador might have chosen the path of stealth, but the instincts of a lifetime in armor ran too deep in me for that. I pressed myself back into a doorway and waited for the first of my opponents to round the corner. I caught a glimpse of a pair of wide eyes beneath an open-face helmet and an autogun held in black-gloved hands, then ducked low, swept the legs out from under him, and planted my dagger in his chest before he hit the ground. I took the weapon from his corpse, flicked the safety catch, and aimed it at the dead man's companions. I had overestimated their number. There were only 4, counting the one bleeding his last onto my boots. I killed the second with a shot between the eyes before she had a chance to pull the trigger. The 2 survivors finally sprang into action, their autoguns filling the corridor with a shower of slugs, but they were too slow. One round ricocheted off my left pauldron, but I barely slowed, and the moment I reached them, the battle was over. I had the training of an Oblivion Knight, and even scorched, battered, and without my sword, this was never going to be a fair fight. I kicked the barrel of the nearest guard's autogun to the side, put a round through her skull, then turned to see the last survivor wrestling furiously with the jammed mechanism of her weapon. I fired another shot, and she fell. 4 bodies. 5 if I counted the laborer I had shot in the cavern. 6 if his companion had succumbed to his injuries. Once again, I had the nagging sense that I was the wrong person for this job. Malcador had expected subtlety and discretion, and instead, I was cutting my way through the High Duke's household like a flensing knife through skin. I took the dead guard's spare ammunition and the Vox unit from her belt. The channel was open, a frenzy of communication passing back and forth between the High Duke and his underlings. The fact of my survival was now known, and from what I was hearing, every guard in Shel'tain was converging on my position. "Secure the nursery," the High Duke said. Even through the crackling Vox link, I could hear the urgency in his voice. "Unas and his squad are already on their way, my lord," a woman's voice answered. The mention of a nursery piqued my curiosity. To the best of my knowledge, the High Duke's progeny were long since grown, distributed across Terra as diplomatic envoys. I had seen no children during my extensive tour of the facilities, and even if there were any, what threat did Sathir think I posed to them? "Go quickly," he added, in a tone that brooked no argument. "I will meet you there." I turned off the Vox unit, and spared a few seconds to check through the dead guard's ident tags. Unas was the one I had shot in the throat. The metal disc that bore his name warm and slick with freshly spilled blood. I took his access wafer, on the assumption that his clearance would exceed that of the laborer I had robbed before, then got to my feet. This squad had been moving towards the nursery. Whoever was in there, the High Duke was adamant that I should not be allowed to reach it, which meant it was exactly where I intended to be. I picked up my pace and continued in the direction the guards had been heading, past the side tunnel that led back to the generator chamber and continuing deeper into the rock, until I reached a huge set of double doors marked with the family's crow and longship crest. Sounds of shouting echoed down the passageway behind me. I waved Unis's access wafer in front of the sensor on the wall. Its light flared scarlet, and with a sonorous click, the door swung open. The room inside was dark and cloyingly humid. I took a wary step across the threshold, and the door immediately slammed shut behind me. As my eyes acclimatized, I saw that the chamber was circular in shape. A greenish glow emanated from a series of water-filled glassine tanks, each one 3 meters in height and balanced on top of a plinth of polished black stone. Wrist-thick metal conduits connected one pillar to the next, and though the design was unfamiliar to me, I recognized the dull luster of the stone from my days in the Somnus Citadel. The material formed part of its vast arsenal of psi negation technology, and to find it here was deeply unsettling. A faint, low hum vibrated through the stone floor. I moved towards the nearest of the tanks with a growing sense of unease. I raised a hand to wipe condensation from its surface, and as I did so, a humanoid shape inside recoiled from my presence, stirring the thick liquid into a froth of bubbles. Each tank contained a naked human, each in a different stage of development, ranging from a tiny sickle of flesh to a fully developed adult man.
"I knew you would come,"
a young woman said. I looked up and saw the source of the voice. A slight human figure in a plain robe, standing behind a containment field that separated the main room from a shallow alcove set into the far wall. A pair of thin hands pushed back the hood, revealing watchful gray eyes set in a face with pale skin stretched over high cheekbones like a silken veil over a skull. "What is this place?" I asked her.
"My father calls it the nursery."
Her lips curled with distaste.
"A playground for his gene rights."
"Why does he keep you here?" The young woman was staring at me with undisguised fascination.
"I see you with my eyes, but you are not there."
Her reaction was astonishing. From what she was saying, she had to be a psychic, but if that were the case, I would have expected her to be vomiting on the ground by now, or pressed back against the wall of her alcove to put as much distance between us as possible. She looked unsettled, but her voice stayed steady.
"I need you to trust me."
A laugh blurted out of my throat. "And why should I do that?"
"I have seen your futures."
"Nonsense." I turned my attention back to the door, straining my ears to make out the approaching footsteps. How many guards were coming? Any more than 6 or 7 at once, and I would struggle to hold them off.
And yet it is so.
The young woman shook her head. Her hands were shaking, too. The effort of will it took to stand so close to me must have been tremendous.
You are hidden from my gifts, but I see the ripples of your passing like a stone in the river. My father,
her mouth twisted around the word,
believes that if you leave Shel'tain alive, the family and the fortress will fall.
Did you send the servant to tell him that? Is that why he ordered my death? My every instinct was screaming at me to kill the Psyker, to deal with this distraction and turn my attention to the approaching enemy, but something stayed my hand. Time away from the sisterhood was making me soft. Footsteps reached the other side of the door, and the High Duke spoke, his voice muffled by the thick metal. I mean you no harm, Lady Amendera. I wish only to talk. I ignored him, still facing the young woman. If you can see the future, how do I survive this? The Psyker pointed to a compact gray power source set into the wall. Wires from its lower edge connected the cables that ran from the granite plinths.
Disable the psi negation field.
The statement was so absurd that I laughed again. Ha! You must think me a fool! The door opened. I put my back to the wall as the High Duke strode into the room, a phalanx of guards filling the doorway behind him. A sheen of sweat stood out on his top lip, and I had the impression that his remarkable composure was close to its limits, but his hand was steady on the grip of his plasma pistol. Kindly drop your weapon, he said. I calculated the distance between us and came to an unpleasant conclusion. I could certainly get a shot off before the guards returned fire, but it would be the last thing I ever did. Why did you try to have me killed? I asked instead. The High Duke's eyes flickered to the girl behind the containment field, then back to me. Your fate and that of my family are intimately intertwined. I receive word from my seer that if you are allowed to leave this place, my house will fall. So you decided that killing an agent of Lord Malkador was preferable? A hasty decision, I grant you, the High Duke smiled. And yet, that decision has served only to highlight your impressive skills. A woman of your aptitude and experience would be welcome as a part of my household. We have profited greatly from the Psykers our gene rights have engineered, from the family bloodline over the last few decades. With their foreknowledge, the strings of fate can be pulled in our favor. I can see no reason why you would not also thrive here. I stared at him, trying to untangle the meaning from his flowery words. Was he offering me a job? My service is already pledged, I said. Indeed. The High Duke spoke calmly, as though we were meeting over drinks in his parlor, instead of in a Gene Wright's horror-filled laboratory. Pledged to a man who fails to appreciate your unique gifts. You are a warrior to the core, Lady Amendera. To attempt to reforge a master-crafted weapon such as yourself is a travesty. As head of my household guard in Shel'tain, you would live a life of comfort, accorded status befitting your skills. I gave myself a moment to consider. I had no reason to trust the High Duke, but the prospect of continued existence did seem preferable to death by plasma. More than that, he was offering me a return to a simpler life, one where my sole duty would be to fight and kill on command. Shel'tain would be my prison, but it would be a gilded one. And if I refuse, I said, wondering if I sounded as uncertain as I felt, what will you tell Lord Malkador or the next agent he sends to investigate my disappearance? He gave an elegant, one-shouldered shrug. I will have the currents of fate examined once again and choose the path that promises the best of all possible futures for my family. Your family. I gestured to the tanks and their unnatural contents. Like these wretches? The High Duke laughed, a derisive sound with no mirth or warmth. These? They might share my blood, but that hardly makes them human.
You cannot let him do this!
The young woman behind the containment field shouted. I turned and saw genuine panic on her face, her eyes locked onto mine with desperate intensity.
You cannot trust him! All of this is his doing! The experiments, the failed attempts, I have seen it all!
The High Duke ignored her. You yourself were made to hunt these mutants, Lady Amendera. I simply wish to put them to profitable use, for the good of my family and the Imperium. Very well, I said, and the High Duke's face widened into a beaming smile. A wise decision. I stooped and placed the autogun on the ground. The girl behind me gave a long, drawn-out wail of despair. I commend you on your foresight, the High Duke said. In one smooth movement, I rose to my feet and hurled my dagger into the module that connected the stone plinths. There was a dull implosion, then sparks showered into air that stank of ozone as the light went out. I threw myself into the shadow behind the closest of the tanks. The hum of the psi negator ceased, and the reaction from the psychers inside the chambers was instantaneous, the room filling with the sound of limbs slamming against glass.
This is how it ends,
the young woman said. Liar, the High Duke growled. Lumen beams mounted to the guards' weapons pierced the darkness like spotlights. You are a seer, mutant, nothing more. How can you hope to— The tank nearest the door erupted in a fountain of synthetic amnion and broken glass. Slugs tore through the air as the psyker inside slithered to the ground, but they bounced harmlessly away as though stopped by an invisible force field. Kill them all! The High Duke howled. Then his voice was abruptly silenced. One moment he had been a living, breathing man, the next he was a crumpled sphere of raw meat and jagged bone ends that hung for an instant in the air before falling wetly to the ground. The psyker from the tank raised a gel-slick hand and sent the first rank of guards flying backwards. They hit the walls of the passageway hard enough that I heard bones rupture, followed by a series of crunches and squelches as they suffered the same fate as their master. The room fell silent. I lit my own lumen, recovered my autogun, and pointed it at the psyker's head. The man made no effort to move. Blood was seeping from his eyes and nose, mixing with the thick fluid that clung to his skin. Pink froth bubbled on his lips with each labored gasp. He was dying.
I could hear him,
the girl said.
My brother. All this time I could hear him in my head. The pain he was in. How much he wanted to die.
The psyker's eyes fixed upon mine, his breathing becoming slower and more ragged. The power he had displayed was terrifying, even more so when I considered that I was mere meters away from him. If the High Duke had been allowed to breed more monstrosities such as this, the risk to the Imperium would have been unimaginable. I waited until he had breathed his last before I looked away. The room stank like a charnel house. I had a sudden urge for clean air, but I had one more matter to attend to before I could leave.
Don't,
the girl said before I turned.
Please.
Her hands reached out to me, her gray eyes beseeching. The sight would have been a pitiful one if there had been any pity left in me. Years of training, and every instinct in my body urged me to kill her. Despite being an unwilling slave, she was the key to the High Duke's schemes, and turning on her master at the last did nothing to atone for her past. Everything I knew told me that the only mercy I owed her was a quick death.
Please,
she said again.
I can be useful to you.
I beckoned her forward, but she didn't move. She was like an animal at bay, unsure of whether it was an invitation to freedom or to death, and in truth, I had not yet decided. She may indeed prove useful to her cause, but I could already see the look of disgust on my fellow agents' faces and hear the superstitious whisperings of the adepts and attendants in Lord Malkador's service were I to return with a psyker in tow. She would bring ill fortune, turn fate against us, interfere with our great work and the manifest destiny of humankind. But it was that thought, more than anything else, that led me to spare her. Superstition and fear of the unknown may well be etched deep into the heart of humanity, but they were no basis for rational decision-making. And if what the girl said was true, if she really could see the branching strands of the future like streams of running water, then she would be of immeasurable use to me in my service to Lord Malkador and the throne. I hoped my patron would agree. Do you have a name? I said, turning away before she answered. The sound of delicate footsteps told me that she was following me.
He never gave me one,
she replied. She stopped to take one last look at the restless figures in their glass prisons.
What will happen to the others?
She asked. That will be for Lord Malkador to decide, I told her. Their fate, like mine, lay in his hands. That was the Shel'tain affair. Written by Jude Reed. Unofficial audio narration by Joe Silva. All Warhammer rights and materials belonging to Games Workshop. This is a fan-made, unaffiliated project.